The mess sergeant's name was Harold Quinton Briggs, and he'd been feeding soldiers since before most of the men in his unit had learned to shave. He was 34 years old in the autumn of 1944, a compact, deliberate man from Macon, Georgia, with flour-dusted forearms and the unhurried confidence of someone who had spent 15 years mastering a craft the Army never quite figured out how to classify. He was not a rifleman. He was not a tanker or a paratrooper or a demolitions specialist. He held the rank of staff sergeant. His MOS designated him a cook, and in the social hierarchy of the United States Army, an institution that rewarded aggression and physical courage above almost everything else, that designation placed him somewhere between the motor pool clerk and the battalion dentist. The German officers, when they first encountered men like Briggs, did not know what to make of him. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. It was not the man himself that confused them. It was what surrounded him. The field kitchens, the insulated Marmite cans stacked in neat columns beside the supply trucks, the smell, that extraordinary, impossible smell of actual hot food drifting across the frozen Belgian countryside in the middle of the worst winter Europe had seen in a generation. When the first senior German officers were processed through American prisoner of war collection points in late 1944 and early 1945, many of them asked the same question, in different ways at different times, with the same bewildered expression pinching at the corners of their eyes. They wanted to know who, exactly, was being fed that well. The answer, there was the ordinary American enlisted soldier, the private and the corporal and the buck sergeant, produced a silence in many of those men that their interrogators found more interesting than anything they said aloud. To understand why that silence was so loaded, you have to understand what German military culture believed about food. The Wehrmacht's relationship with rations was not simply a logistical matter. It was ideological. The German military tradition, stretching back to the Franco-Prussian War and deep into the starvation and humiliation of the First World War's aftermath, had built an entire cultural framework around the idea of Spartan endurance. The soldier who suffered, who went hungry, who tightened his belt and kept marching, that soldier was a German ideal. Hardship was not a failure of the system. It was proof of the system's virtue. This was not merely propaganda. It was institutionalized in the actual structure of Wehrmacht logistics. The German field ration, designated the Hierarchies, was calculated on a sliding scale that openly and deliberately prioritized officers over enlisted men. A German infantry hauptmann, a captain, received a daily ration allocation that exceeded his enlisted soldiers by a meaningful margin, not only in quantity but in variety and quality. Senior officers in the field, majors and above, were entitled to supplemental provisions, separate messing facilities when conditions permitted, and in some rear area postings, access to wine, schnapps, and preserved delicacies that never appeared anywhere near the common soldier's mess tin. This was considered entirely natural. Rank had privileges, and food was one of them. The Wertvergungsamt, the German Army Supply and Provisions Office, had codified this hierarchy down to the gram. A German enlisted infantryman in the field was allocated roughly 3,500 calories per day on paper during active operations, a figure that sounds reasonable until you account for the catastrophic failures of German supply logistics by the middle years of the war, at which point the actual calories reaching a man in the foxhole bore almost no relationship to the theoretical allocation. By the autumn of 1944, the average German infantryman on the Western Front was subsisting on somewhere between 1,500 and 2,200 calories per day, depending on where he was, what army group he belonged to, and whether his supply lines were currently being bombed by the 8th Air Force. The bread was often stale. The ersatz coffee was made from roasted acorns or chicory. Hot meals were a luxury that arrived, when they arrived at all, in the dark hours of early morning to avoid Allied air observation, carried forward through shell-churned mud by exhausted Hilfswillage, auxiliary supply workers who were themselves half-starved. The American system was designed on an entirely different philosophical foundation, and it is worth spending time on that foundation, because it explains something important about the United States Army that the Germans consistently failed to understand until they were sitting across a table from an American interrogator, eating warm food. The United States Army Field Manual Governing Subsistence, FM 1020, updated through successive editions during the war years, proceeded from a premise that German military doctrine would have found almost incomprehensible, that a well-fed soldier was a more effective soldier, regardless of rank, and that therefore the primary obligation of the Army's supply and feeding apparatus was the man in the field, not to the man at the headquarters table. This was not altruism. It was industrial logic applied to human performance. American military planners in the 1930s and early 40s had access to a body of nutritional science that had advanced enormously since the First World War. The work of researchers like Elmer McCullum at Johns Hopkins and the practical findings of the Committee on Food and Nutrition established under the National Research Council in 1940 had given the Army a detailed, evidence-based understanding of what soldiers actually needed, not just calories, but specific vitamins, minerals, and protein ratios to maintain combat effectiveness over extended periods. The result was the B ration and the C ration, two systems that, for all their flaws, represented something genuinely remarkable in the history of military logistics. The B ration was a standard field ration for troops in areas where kitchen facilities could be established, even temporarily. It included fresh or canned meat, potatoes, vegetables, bread or crackers, coffee, sugar, and supplemental items like jam, cheese, and when the supply chain was functioning, fresh eggs and dairy. The daily caloric target for AB ration was approximately 4,200 calories for soldiers in active combat operations, a figure that exceeded the German officer's allocation, let alone the German enlisted man's. The C ration, the individual combat ration issued when field kitchens were impossible, was 3 cans per day, containing meat and beans or meat and vegetable hash, hard crackers, instant coffee, sugar, cigarettes, and a small accessory packet with items like toilet paper, water purification tablets, and an opener. It was not beloved. Soldiers complained about it with a creative vehemence that survives in thousands of letters and diaries. But it provided roughly 3,200 calories. It was consistent and, crucially, it was the same for every rank. A private first class in the United States Army ate the same C ration as his company commander. This was the fact that landed so strangely among German prisoners. Not the abundance alone, though the abundance was real and astonishing to men who had been eating acorn coffee and stale bread for months. It was the quality of it, the idea that the American Army had organized its feeding apparatus around the proposition that the private stomach mattered as much as a colonel's. To understand what that looked like in practice, you need to understand what Harold Briggs and men like him actually did. The Army cook, MOS 060 in the wartime classification system, was theoretically a straightforward support role. In practice, feeding an American infantry company in the field during active operations in Western Europe in the winter of 1944 was an exercise in sustained improvisation under conditions that would have broken most supply chains entirely. Briggs was assigned to a rifle company of the 1st United States Army, one of the units fighting its way through the Hurtgen Forest in November and early December of 1944, a stretch of dense, dark, artillery-scarred woodland along the German-Belgian border that consumed American infantry at a rate that appalled even the senior commanders who had ordered the advance. The Hurtgen Forest, roughly 50 square miles of heavily fortified terrain that the Germans had spent years preparing as a defensive obstacle, became one of the costliest and most miserable battles the United States Army fought in the entire European theater. From September of 1944 through February of 1945, American forces suffered approximately 33,000 combat casualties in that forest, plus an additional 9,000 non-battle casualties from trench foot, hypothermia, and combat exhaustion. Conditions directly related to the cold, wet, and unrelenting misery of living for weeks in waterlogged foxholes under constant shell fire. The men who survived that forest wrote about the cold the way men write about things that get inside them and refuse to leave. The temperature rarely climbed above freezing. Rain turned to sleet, and sleet turned to snow, and the forest floor was a permanent ooze of mud and pine needles. And, in the worst sectors, the unburied dead. In that environment, a hot meal was not a comfort. It was a medical intervention. The Army's own medical corps had formally recognized this by 1943. The connection between caloric intake, core body temperature, and combat effectiveness in cold weather operations was documented in multiple theater medical reports and translated directly into supply priority guidelines. Hot food for forward infantry units was classified not as a morale item, but as a readiness requirement. Briggs understood this intuitively, the way a man who has spent his adult life feeding people understands it. He had two M1937 field ranges, portable gasoline-powered stoves roughly the size of a large suitcase, two kitchen trailers stocked with whatever the supply system had managed to deliver that week, and a pair of Marmite containers, insulated metal canisters designed to keep food at serving temperature for up to 4 hours, that he sent forward with the carrying parties whenever the tactical situation permitted. The tactical situation rarely permitted it easily. Forward positions in the Hurtgen were sometimes 2 miles of broken, shelled terrain from the nearest road where kitchen vehicles could operate. Getting hot food from a field range to man in a foxhole meant loading the Marmite containers onto a jeep or, when no road existed, onto the backs of volunteers who carried them to the dark on foot, ducking shell fire, navigating by memory through forests so thick that daylight barely reached the ground. Briggs did this, not because the regulations required him to personally carry the food forward. They did not, but because he had developed the opinion, somewhere in a month since his unit landed in France, that the men in the foxholes had earned whatever he could manage to get to them, and that getting it to them was the actual job, not the easier version of the job that ended at the field kitchen. The German prisoners began arriving at American collection points in significant numbers after the failure of the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, in January and February of 1945. They came in every condition. Some were near hypothermic, having spent weeks in the Belgian snow in uniforms that the German supply system had catastrophically failed to winterize. Some were wounded. Some were simply exhausted in the specific way that men who have been fighting without adequate food for months are exhausted, not just physically depleted but hollowed out, moving to the world at a reduced intensity, as though someone had turned down the brightness on everything. The standard procedure at American POW collection points included a medical screening, an interrogation by military intelligence personnel, and, in most cases, a meal. The meal was not designed as a psychological operation. It was designed as a logistical and humanitarian necessity. The Geneva Convention, to which the United States scrupulously adhered, required that prisoners be fed at the same standard as the detaining power's own rear echelon troops. American rear echelon troops ate B rations. German prisoners therefore ate B rations. But the effect was psychological anyway, because the German prisoners, including the officers, had not been eating anything remotely comparable to a B ration for months. A German infantry major captured near Bastogne in late January of 1945. His name appears in the interrogation records of the 12th Army Group as Major Helmut Sturzing, age 38, from Stuttgart, reportedly sat in the intake tent at an American POW processing station and stared at his food tray for almost a full minute before eating. The tray contained hot beef stew, white bread, canned peaches, and coffee with sugar. The interrogating officer, a first lieutenant from Ohio who spoke functional German, asked what was wrong with the food. Sturzing said nothing was wrong with it. He said the problem was that it was better than what he had been eating as an officer of the Wehrmacht for the past 4 months. He asked, with what the interrogation report characterizes as genuine bewilderment, whether the Americans fed their officers and their private soldiers from the same kitchen. The lieutenant told him yes. Sturzing apparently had no immediate response to this. The interrogation report notes a pause of several seconds before he resumed eating. These moments, and there were hundreds of them, documented in interrogation reports, unit diaries, and the post-war testimonies of both American soldiers and German prisoners, illuminate something that tends to get lost in the broad sweep of how the Second World War is remembered. The war is remembered correctly as a conflict decided by industrial production, strategic air power, amphibious logistics, and the sacrifice of millions of soldiers. The numbers are staggering enough to make the human scale hard to hold on to. The United States produced 49,000 tanks between 1940 and 1945, 86,000 aircraft. The Liberty ship program launched more than 2,700 cargo vessels in 4 years. The numbers are so large they stop meaning anything at a certain point. But the war was also decided, in ways that are harder to quantify and easier to overlook, by the fact that the United States Army had made a philosophical commitment to the individual soldier that its principal adversary had not. The German Army's logistical culture was hierarchical, rigid, and increasingly unable to cope with the demands of a two-front war of attrition that its planners had never seriously prepared for. The Wehrmacht supply system was designed for the Blitzkrieg model, fast, aggressive, living off the land and off captured enemy stores, striking so quickly that extended logistics were never necessary. That model had worked in Poland in 39 days. It had worked in France in 46. It had not worked in the Soviet Union, and by the autumn of 1944, it was failing spectacularly in Western Europe. The American supply system, by contrast, had been designed from the beginning for exactly the kind of sustained, grinding, material-intensive war of attrition that the Second World War became. The Red Ball Express, the improvised truck convoy system that operated from August to November of 1944, moved over 400,000 tons of supplies from the Normandy beaches to the front lines in 81 days, running around the clock, driven almost entirely by black American soldiers of the Transportation Corps who received almost none of the recognition their achievement deserved. If you find the story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Quartermaster Corps, which the Army itself had historically treated as a secondary service branch, had been transformed by the demands of global war into one of the most sophisticated logistics organizations in military history. By late 1944, the Quartermaster Corps was moving approximately 20,000 tons of supplies per day across the Western European theater. Food, fuel, ammunition, clothing, medical supplies, through a distribution network that ran from the docks at Cherbourg and Marseilles to field depots to divisional supply points to company kitchens to the Marmite, container being carried forward through the Hürtgen forest in the dark. That network had inefficiencies. It had bottlenecks and failures, an inevitable friction of any enormous organization operating under combat conditions. But it worked in the fundamental sense that the American soldier in the field almost always had food, and the food was almost always adequate, and the food did not depend on his rank. The contrast was not lost on the German soldiers who encountered it. A captured enlisted man of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, one of the most fanatically motivated formations in the entire Wehrmacht, was processed through an American collection point near Liège in late January of 1945. He was 17 years old. He had been in combat for 6 weeks and had not eaten a hot meal in 11 days. When he was given a tray of American field rations, the same tray that every other prisoner in the tent received, the same tray the American MP standing by the door would eat from his own lunch that afternoon, he reportedly looked around the tent as though expecting someone to take it away from him and give him something inferior instead. The American interpreter asked him what he was looking for. He said he was looking for the officers, because he assumed the better food would be going to the officers, and what he had been given was the enlisted men's share. The interpreter told him that the food in front of him was a standard ration, the same for everyone. The 17-year-old SS soldier, who had been trained since childhood in an ideology that insisted German strength derived from hierarchy, sacrifice, and the iron subordination of the individual to the collective, sat with that information for a long moment. Then he ate. The Bastogne corridor, which American forces had fought to keep open through the worst weeks of the Bulge, had become by late January a symbol of something that was difficult to articulate at the time, but is clearer in retrospect. It was not just a tactical success. It was a demonstration, crude, imperfect, conducted in miserable cold by exhausted men, of what an army that had genuinely invested in its soldiers could sustain. The 101st Airborne Division had been surrounded at Bastogne from December 19th to December 26th. During those 7 days, the division received no ground supply at all. The temperature dropped to minus 14 degrees Celsius on some nights. Men wrapped their feet in burlap sacks because their supply of winter boots had not yet arrived. Artillery ammunition ran so short that battery commanders were ordered to hold fire, except in the most critical defensive situations. And yet the division held. The reasons are multiple and complex. The leadership of Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the defensive quality of the American infantry soldier, the fundamental tactical soundness of the perimeter, the extraordinary courage of individual men and units, but the nutritional and caloric preparation that the American Army had invested in those soldiers before they ever reached Bastogne was also part of the calculation. Men who had been eating 4,000 calories a day for months, who had been receiving adequate vitamins and protein, who had been treated as though their physical welfare was a legitimate military priority. Those men had reserves, physical and psychological reserves that had been built up deliberately over time by a system that valued them. Sergeant Briggs was not at Bastogne. His unit was in the Hurtgen, fighting a different misery in a different forest. But the principle that governed his work, that the man in the foxhole deserved the same food as the man at the headquarters table, and that getting it to him was a job, was the same principle that had stocked those paratroopers' bodies with the reserves they needed to hold a crossroad in Belgium for 7 days in the coldest December in living memory. The German commanders who eventually faced these men across interrogation tables or surrendered documents or the wreckage of failed counteroffensives were encountering the physical product of a decision the United States had made years before the first shot was fired in Europe. The decision was not glamorous. It did not produce headlines or medals or the kind of military history that fills shelves at airport bookstores. It was made by nutritionists and quartermaster officers and congressional appropriations committees and the unglamorous men of the subsistence branch who spent the war calculating caloric requirements and negotiating canning contracts. But it was, in its quiet way, as consequential as any decision the American High Command made during the entire war. By the spring of 1945, the Wehrmacht was disintegrating, not collapsing suddenly, the way a structure fails all at once when a load-bearing element goes, but dissolving the way something dissolves when it has been weakened from the inside for long enough that the outer surface can no longer hold. Units that had fought with cohesion and determination in Normandy and Arnhem, and the Hurtgen were surrendering by the platoon, then the company, then the battalion, in a cascade that the German High Command had no mechanism to stop, because the mechanisms, the supply system, the communications network, the replacement pipeline, the food, had already failed. American interrogation reports from March and April of 1945 document, with a consistency that becomes almost monotonous by the 100th file, the same basic story. German soldiers who had believed in the war, or at least in the system they had been embedded in since adolescence, encountering American abundance and discovering that the beliefs they had been given about what was possible, about what a soldier could expect, about what a military could provide, about the relationship between rank and privilege, did not correspond to what they found. Major Sturzing, the Stuttgart officer captured near Bastogne, was held at a prisoner of war camp in England for several months before being repatriated in late 1946. He gave a recorded interview to a British military historian in 1961, by which point he had become a minor figure in the growing field of post-war German military memoir literature. He was asked about his capture and the early weeks of his captivity. He said that the most disorienting thing was not the loss of his command, or the shame of surrender, or even the simple physical relief of being out of fighting. The most disorienting thing, he said, was the food, not because it was so extraordinary. It was not extraordinary. It was ordinary. That was precisely the point. It was the food of ordinary men, prepared without ceremony or hierarchy, distributed without reference to rank, available to the private and the major alike, and it was better, more consistent, more nutritious, more reliably hot than what he'd been eating as a commissioned officer of the Wehrmacht. He said it took him several weeks to understand what that meant, not as a tactical or strategic insight, but as a statement about what the two armies had actually been, at the most fundamental level, what they had believed about their soldiers, and what those beliefs had produced. Briggs, by that point, was back in Macon. He had been discharged in September 1945, returned to Georgia, married a woman named Eunice who taught school in the county, and taken a job managing the kitchen at a hospital in the city. He was 35 years old. He had fed American soldiers through the Hurtgen forest, through the retreat from the Bulge's initial shock, through the crossing of the Rhine and the drive into the German heartland. He had lost men he knew. He had carried Marmite containers through shellfire that, as he would tell his son years later, had no business leaving him alive. He did not consider himself a hero. He considered himself a cook. In the summer of 1948, the Army War College at Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania, commissioned a series of post-war studies on the logistical lessons of the Second World War. One of the studies examined the relationship between soldier nutrition and combat effectiveness in the European theater. The study drew on unit medical records, quartermaster reports, post-war interviews with German officers and enlisted men, and statistical analysis of casualty patterns across American divisions. Its conclusions were careful, hedged in the language of institutional reports, and largely ignored by the military press and the public history of the war. But they were, within their careful hedging, striking. The study found a statistically significant correlation between the regularity and quality of hot meal delivery to forward units and the maintenance of unit cohesion under sustained combat stress. It found that American units which received hot meals at least once per day during extended defensive operations showed measurably lower rates of combat exhaustion, trench foot, and disciplinary breakdown than units which did not. It found, in its section on prisoner of war interrogation analysis, that the dietary contrast between American and German field rations was among the most commonly cited factors by German prisoners when asked to identify aspect of American military capability they had not anticipated. The report named no individual soldiers. It did not mention Briggs or the Hurtgen or the insulated Marmite, containers being carried through the dark. Reports of that kind do not work that way. But it was, at its core, a document about what Harold Briggs and hundreds of men like him had done, and what it had meant. There is a tendency, in the decades since the Second World War, to tell the story of American victory in terms of the large and the dramatic, the Normandy landings, the liberation of Paris, the crossing of the Rhine, Patton's Drive, the meeting at the Elbe. These are the images that have survived because they are the images that fit the narrative shape we require history, the turning points, the decisive moments, the individuals who stood at the hinge of events and pushed. The story of how the United States Army fed its soldiers does not fit that shape. It has no single dramatic moment, no crossroads held against impossible odds, no last-minute airdrop, no defiant radio transmission, no general's famous one-word reply to a demand for surrender. It is instead the story of a decision made before the war began, embedded in field manuals and appropriations budgets, and the professional opinions of nutritionists whom almost no one remembers. It is the story of men like Briggs, who spent 4 years of their lives doing the unglamorous, essential, daily work of keeping other men alive and functional, not because the regulations required them to do it in a particular way they did it, but because they understood that the work mattered. And it is the story of German officers sitting in American collection points in the winter of 1944 and 1945, eating the same food as the privates, trying to locate the category error that would explain how the American Army had arranged the world this way. The category error, of course, was not in the American system. It was in the assumption that a soldier's rank determined his worth. The United States Army, whatever its many and considerable flaws, had built its feeding apparatus on the opposite assumption, that the private in the foxhole had earned his meal as fully as the colonel at the headquarters table, and that providing it to him was not generosity, but obligation. That assumption, multiplied across the 10 million men of the wartime American Army, across 4,000 field kitchens and 10,000 Marmite containers, and exhausted men who carried them forward through the dark, that assumption had consequences. The Germans found out what they were. Harold Quinton Briggs died in Macon, Georgia, in 1987. He was 77 years old. His obituary in the Macon Telegraph listed his survivors, his church membership, and his 31 years of service to the hospital kitchen, where he had worked since coming home from the war. It mentioned his Army service in a single line, noting that he had served in the European theater and received an honorable discharge. It did not mention the Hurtgen Forest. It did not mention the Marmite containers or the men who ate from them, or the German major who had sat in an intake tent near Bastogne and stared at a tray of hot beef stew. Try to understand what it meant that an American private ate, as well as a Wehrmacht Kommandant. The men who received that food were home by then too, or most of them were. Some were still in hospitals. Some were in cemeteries in Belgium and France and Germany, under the white markers that stand in such perfect rows that the rows themselves become a kind of silence. They had been fed. It mattered. Most of them never thought about it as a thing that had been done for them, because when something is done consistently and reliably and without ceremony, it tends to disappear into background experience, indistinguishable from the ordinary expectations of a life. But in the interrogation rooms and the prisoner of war compounds of Western Europe in the winter of 1944 and 1945, men who had come from a different system, men who had been told that sacrifice and hierarchy and the acceptance of hardship were the virtues that made soldiers great, sat with trays of food they had not expected and tried to reconcile what they were eating with what they had been taught. The reconciliation, for many of them, took a long time. For some of them, it never fully came. The war ended on the 8th of May, 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender at Reims, France. The document was signed at 2:41 in the morning in a schoolhouse that had been serving as General Eisenhower's headquarters by German military representatives who had nothing left to negotiate with. The Allied armies that had produced that moment were already beginning the long, complicated process of becoming something other than armies. The millions of men who would become fathers and factory workers and teachers and hospital kitchen managers, carrying with them whatever the war had given them and whatever it had taken. The German prisoners were still in the camps, eating American rations, waiting for the repatriation process to work its slow way through the 4 million men who had surrendered in the final weeks of the war. Major Sturzing, according to his 1961 interview, ate every meal in the camp with the same attentiveness he had brought to that first tray near Bastogne. He said he never stopped noticing that the food was the same for everyone. He said he was not sure, even 15 years later, whether that was the most remarkable thing about the Americans or simply the thing he happened to have been in the right position to observe. He thought it was probably both. The cook from Macon would have understood. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.